I mean, if we said that phrase, they would say, people around you, I know who said that. Many times a politician has to have a phrase. President Trump had the phrase, make America great again. In Bill Clinton's era in the 1990s, I think it was the Senate or the Congress as a whole, it had a saying, they had little pins that they wore about, it's the economy, stupid. And that's a nice one. And I know my 10th grade English lit teacher, first day of school, and she goes over the expectations. I remember her saying, clear as a bell, that all your papers that you turn in have to be aesthetically pleasing. And if she said that once, she said that 1,000 times. Well, I just had finished the summer working on my uncle's dairy farm, and many days I spent knee deep in cow doo-doo. So I was just wondering, what would be aesthetically pleasing to you? Because I don't know if the two would be the same. All right, so sometimes people have phrases that they're known for. My last boss at Southeastern Med in Cambridge, Ohio was Dr. Keller. Dr. Keller was a really well-educated man, distinguished man, had been in many places in the world. But when he would give me my list of things he wanted done, he would always end it the same way in his best, and I hope no one gets offended, West Virginian accent. He would say, I want you to do blah, 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 blah. And then he'd look at me, now, Todd, go get her done. So I'd have to go out and get her done. We've been looking at getting her done spiritually for several weeks now. And we're in the book of 2 Corinthians because the book of 2 Corinthians tells us Paul's getting her done. And what the confusing thing to the Corinthians was confusing this spiritual work that needed to be done with the physical world in which they lived in. All right? And many times we gauge spiritual success or spiritual capabilities by physical means, and we can't do that. Every one of you, if you are a child of God here this morning, you have been granted a spiritual gift. And that spiritual gift can be used in the physical world, and many times is, but it's to be used for spiritual purposes. And that spiritual gift, after a while of observation, you can detect what it is. But it's not as easy as a physical gift, which normally you can detect immediately when somebody walks into the room. And that's our problem. We do spiritual assessments with physical tools. And God doesn't work that way. And the song I remember hearing, I can't remember the singer's name. When others see a shepherd boy, God may see a king. And so a lot of times we get the physical world and the spiritual realm confused. And this is what sometimes we try to accomplish spiritual work, but we have a physical mindset about us. So it's physical work that needs done, but we're approaching it like it was a physical task. And that many times gets us into trouble. And so here's what happens. Sometimes in the physical realm, negative things happen, but it impacts our spirits dramatically, and many times we become frustrated. What do I mean? Say you're a pastor, you're an evangelist. Your work is spiritual, but say something physically happens to you. You come down with cancer. You come down with a chronic disease. You come down with something else that is impacting you physically. Your work isn't physical, but you do it in your physical body. Your work is spiritual. But many times what happens in that physical realm impacts our spiritual understanding and desires to the point that we are frustrated, not because something spiritual happened, but because something physically happened to us. And so Paul is going to, if you have a chronic condition, you know what I'm talking about. Because day in and day out, you not only fight spiritual battles, you fight physical battles. And they sometimes can take a toll on you spiritually. That's what I'm getting at here. So, many times in our spiritual realm, when it looks like physical defeat, it is actually a spiritual victory waiting to happen. What do I mean by that? Look at Jesus Christ dying on the cross. Physically, that looked like a defeat, did it not? But that was the greatest spiritual victory in human history when Jesus hung on that cross. So sometimes when things look devastating spiritually, don't get all caught, or physically, don't get all caught up in that and let it take your spirit to a position God doesn't want it to be. In other words, we need to learn to distinguish, I'm a spiritual creature living in a physical world, but many times I let that physical world affect me as a spiritual creature. And there needs to be a delineation between the two. So that's what we're going to focus on today, because that's what Paul is focusing on in this passage right here. And so we're going to take a look at that. First, we're going to take a look at, as it's on the screen, the context of chapter 4. Second, the Christian paradoxes. Third, David's warning about a hasty spirit. And third, spiritual focus in a physical world. So that's what we're going to take a look at. So the first thing we need to get in our understanding, is take a look at chapter 4 and verse 1, the context. Chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "Therefore, seeing as we have this ministry, as we have received" what? That's the word we need to focus in on for a second. As we have received mercy. This should not take too long, because last week and Sunday evening we spent a good amount of time going over the Beatitudes, which talks about the merciful. So we brought that up. Mercy is not grace, but it shares something in common in grace. The first thing that we want to note about mercy is it is unmerited. Somebody is going to do something for me, and there's nothing that I have done to merit them wanting to help me. It is an unmerited action. All right? When God saved you by His grace, you weren't doing anything that God said, you know what? I need to help him out. He helped me. I need to help him out. It's unmerited. The second thing in mercy, number one, unmerited. Number two, somebody has to be in a miserable condition. Okay? Number three, mercy, somebody has to join me in my miserable condition. Grace helps me and may understand my miserable condition, but isn't going to join me in it. So for mercy to be mercy, it's unmerited. I have to be in a miserable condition. And number two, somebody has to join me in that miserable condition. All right? Now, when I read this initially, and I think when I explained it a couple of weeks ago, my initial thoughts were, Paul is only talking about the spiritual realm. Why do I say that? Because in chapter 4, verse 1, it says, therefore. When you see the word therefore, you always look to see why it's therefore. You always go to the verses in front of it and see why he came to this conclusion. And it's obvious as you go into chapter 3, he's talking about the spiritual condition of people. But when you drop into chapter 4, something changes. It's not just spiritual in chapter 4. All right? In chapter 4, Paul starts talking about physical conditions. So the Apostle Paul is talking about mercy. So somebody had to be in what kind of a condition? A miserable condition. So in order for mercy to be exercised, all right, somebody had to be in a miserable condition. And folks, Paul was leading and living a Spirit-filled life. But yet God still found him at times in what kind of a condition? Miserable, not spiritually alone, but physically. And we're going to take a look at those conditions in just a moment. All right? So folks, do you enjoy God's mercy? You're saying, I'm not raising my hand now. Do you enjoy God helping you? Do you know then what's required, what condition he's got to find you in order for him to help you? If he's going to give you mercy, he has to find you in what kind of condition? Miserable. Now, we are human beings with a fallen condition, and here is one of the things that drives us. We hate being miserable. How many here say, oh, Pastor Grover, tomorrow pray that I wake up miserable? Nobody prays that. But in order for God to demonstrate mercy, that's how he has to find you. And my guess is he's going to find us all in that condition at various times in our life. Here's what we need to guard against. We cannot, well, let's just follow the verse here. Therefore, seeing we have this ministry, as we have received mercy, we do not what? That word faint, you might want to put that in your margin, means to become utterly spiritless. It's not talking about losing your salvation. It's talking about losing your drive. You ever seen a person who's lost their spirit? You ever seen an animal? This might be easier. A horse that's lost his spirit. They're just out there. They don't want to run. They don't want to do anything. They're spiritless. That's what he's talking about. I can be in such a physical or spiritual condition, in such a state of misery, that I can lose my spirit. I can lose my drive. And hey, listen, after being punched in the gut so many times, both metaphorically and maybe realistically, you may have a tendency to lose your drive to go back in there and fight spiritually if you know you're just going to take another one to the gut. You're just going to get spiritually ransacked. All right? How bad can it get? Look at verse number 10. It says in 2 Corinthians verse 4, always bearing about in the body the dying. That word dying means deadness. It actually means, this ought to cheer you up on a Sunday morning with all of our birthdays, dragging a corpse. I better put that up there. You can feel that bad physically. Paul was saying, I go from Thessalonica to Galatia to Corinth, and I want to give you a mental picture of what's going on in my physical body. It's like dragging a corpse. Now that doesn't picture a nice vivacious life, does it? Paul used the same word in Romans chapter 4, verse 19, talking about Abraham having a child when he's 90 and being not weak in faith. He considered not his own body now what? Now dead. He's talking about his physical body. His physical body felt like it was dead, and God is saying, I want you to go out and have a child. Paul is saying, when I went from place to place to place to minister spiritual truth, let me tell you how I felt on the outside. I felt like I was dragging a dead corpse all around the Middle East. That's what I felt like. Folks, glorious spiritual work is many times accomplished under physical strain. In other words, in order to see glorious spiritual truth and work happen in someone else's life, I may have to put myself in very uncomfortable physical conditions. Like what? No sleep. Like what? Missing meals. Like what? Not getting to the doctor and therefore just living with the condition I have. Like what? Not being able to afford because I'm using my money to do this work that's going to help this person spiritually. Like what? Like all these things. I may have to suffer in my physical body in order to get spiritual truth, spiritual results to happen in not just my life, but someone else's life. So that's the context of 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Now let's look at the Christian paradox. The Christian paradox. The irony of spiritual living in a physical world. Verse number 8. We are troubled on every side. That word troubled means pressed. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever felt like life was just pressing your person so hard that if it pressed any harder, you were afraid your insides would become your outsides? That's how Paul felt. Pressed on every side, yet not what? Yet not crushed. How come, God, I feel like I'm being squeezed, but every day I wake back up and I'm not crushed? I think when I feel like, you know what, have you ever said this to yourself? I just cannot take one more thing. I just cannot have this happen one more day. This just cannot go on any longer, and you're being pushed, you're being squashed, but God sees to it that you're not what? You're not crushed. See, I thought I was going to be crushed, and here I wake up the next day and I'm not what? I'm not crushed. Crushed. We are troubled on every side, but not crushed. We are perplexed. Ever been perplexed? Well, what's it mean? We are in doubt, do not know which way to turn. We don't have any resources. Now, if that at one point in time doesn't describe your life, I want to know what you're doing. We are distressed. We are perplexed. Have you ever been in doubt? You're not a human being if you haven't been in doubt. Do not know which way to turn? Without resources? But in all that, we're not in despair. We have nothing, but yet we lack nothing. The Christian paradox. I don't have anything, and yet I have everything. If I look at my life physically, I can do an assessment and I can come to conclusions based upon what you have. I have nothing. But when I look at my life in the spiritual realm, I can say to myself, hey, listen, in the physical realm, you may have nothing, but in the spiritual realm, you've got everything. Spiritual living in a physical world. And sometimes I can look at the things that I see and do an assessment, and I can become down in the dumps, not on the outside, but on my inside. Paul's saying, listen, let me give you my testimony. This is what has happened. We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We don't know which way to turn, but we are not lost. We are without resources, yet we have no lack. We're persecuted, put to flight, run out of town, but we're not forsaken. We're not alone. People keep running us out of these towns. You think after a while we would run out of friends. But listen, we're always run out of town, but we're never alone, because who is always with me? Cast down, thrown to a lower place, but not destroyed, not ruined. Do people like to cast other people down? But you can't ruin Paul. You can't ruin a Christian. All right? Always bearing about the dying, that dead corpse. Why? So that the life of Christ may be what? Manifest. The dead state of my body, so that Christ may be what? Seen. The Christian paradox. Do you mean to tell me I'll see more vibrant life going on around me on the inside as I die more on the outside? And the answer is yes. That's what he's saying. Because this is, if I die here, how can any of that be brighter? How can any of that, if I'm dying on my outside, then the whole world ought to be gloomy. And that's not true for the Christian. As this perishes, as this outward man perishes, more life can be given to those around me. When Jesus died, they thought, well, good, he's gone, but he wasn't gone. And now all of a sudden, we just don't have to contend with him. We have to contend with a whole bunch of people. He died so that a whole bunch of other people could. And that's what goes on in Christianity. You die on that outside. Things can happen. You can be perplexed. You can be squeezed. You can be run out of town. You can be beaten. But why am I doing this? That's the question, right? I'm close to retirement. I am retired. I'm at the child rearing age. I'm wherever. Why am I putting all this additional work on myself? There's other people in this church. Right? Because that's what Christians do. The more they die out here, the more life they bring out there. The Christian paradox. As I drag this dead body, this corpse, from place to place to place, my prayer is God would use it to bring forth what? Life. I have to, are you telling me this, Pastor Grover? I have to be miserable in order for others to have life? Surely you're not saying that. Okay, I ain't. I'm not. God is. Not all the time miserable, but many times miserable. Have you ever wanted to do something spiritual, but physically you didn't feel like doing it? There's your battle. There it is. Have you ever, God laid it upon your heart to do a ministry, but you answered God no, not because you didn't think you could do it spiritually, it's because you thought you couldn't do it physically. And what what the Lord ministered to my heart is, hey, listen, you're going to die anyway. Go out there and live for me. As your outward man perishes, I can do something to your inward man. I can renew it. How often? Day by day. Listen, that outward thing's going to go into the grave, but that inward man, he can get more excited and excited each and every day. It's not dependent on what next falls off that body and stops working. It's what's going on your inside. The Christian paradox. This outward man perishing and inward stuff going on, flourishing. Many times we have to take a physical hardship in order to see spiritual work accomplished. Now, let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, David's warning. Pastor Grover, now we know you lost it. You're calling this David's warning when 2 Corinthians was obviously written by Paul. Well, look at verse number 13. We, having the same spirit of faith, according as it is written, I believed and therefore have I spoken. All right? Therefore have I spoken, we also believe, and therefore we speak. Does anybody have a cross-reference? Psalm 116, verse 10. So let's turn back and look at Psalm 116, verse 10. I don't think I put that up there because I think we can all find the book of Psalms. Just close your Bible, open it square in the middle. You should be in the book of Psalms. Turn to Psalm 116. So what's Paul talking about in 2 Corinthians chapter 4? Misery, physical hardship. Then he quotes Psalm 116 verse 10. So if this is going to match, we're going to apples, we should find David in what kind of condition? Okay. Let's look at verse number 10 first. Verse number 10 and verse number 11 are comparison verses. They're verses to compare. What happens in verse 10, the opposite is implied in verse 11. Verses of comparison. So, verse number 10 says, I what? What's it say? I believed. So, verse number 11 is going to be when David was not believing. They're verses of comparison. They're opposites. So in verse number 10, if I am believing, verse number 11, the implication is he was what? Not believing. So verse number 10, I was believing. What kinds of things do you say when you are believing? First of all, let's get the context. See if he's miserable. I love the Lord because he hath heard my voice and my supplication. What's David doing in verse number 1? He's praying. Because he hath inclined his ear unto me, therefore will I call upon him as long as I live. Okay? Remember, he's doing what? Believing or not believing? He's believing. What condition? Verse 3, the sorrows of death compassed me, and the pains of hell got hold of me. I found trouble and what? So what's that sound like? Misery. But this is the things you say when you have faith in miserable conditions. Look at what he says in these verses here. I think I have them marked out here. Verse 5. Gracious is the who? This is what I say when I believe. Verse 6. The Lord what? The Lord preserves. This is what I say in verse 7. The Lord hath dealt bountifully with me. Verse 8, for the Lord has what? Delivered me. When I go through, verse 3, he's going through what kind of conditions? Miserable conditions. But he's trusting in the Lord. And so when I'm trusting in the Lord, I'm going to say things like that. But now, I believe, therefore have I spoken. When you are spiritually sound, healthy, but yet going through some very difficult times, this is what you're going to say. But what if I'm going through very difficult times and I'm not what? I'm not believing. This is what I'm going to say. Verse 11. I said in my haste, my alarm. The bells are going off. You ever had a 5-alarm fire day? What do I mean by that? Every place you turn, the alarms are going off. I mean, nothing's going right. Ding, ding, just bad, bad, bad. In my alarm, in my haste, in an unbelieving state, this is what I said. I wasn't talking about all these great things that God has done. All right? In my haste, I said, all men are what? Liars. There's two ways that this is known to be interpreted. Number one, David says in verse 11, all who? So who's he trusting? Men. Verse number 10, in my belief, he's talking about God and he makes these statements. I believed. He believed who? He believed God. And when you believe God, you can make all those wonderful statements. And verse number 11, he seems to not be putting his trust in God. He seems to be putting his trust in man. And he says, all men are liars. All men are deceivers. So that could be one way to understand that verse. There's another way to understand it, which is even more potent. All men are deceived if they're putting their faith in God. I said in my haste when I was miserable, you are a bunch of jokers if you're putting your faith in God. He has deceived you. That's how that verse can be taken. See the difference? And what was the thing that initiated all this? Physical what? Physical misery. When I'm believing in physical misery, God can do no wrong. And He can't. But when I'm in an unbelieving state, my spirit has been worn down by my physical misery. In my haste, have you ever said something that as soon as you said it, you wish you could have grabbed those words, get them back? In my haste, I said, I'm a fool for trusting God. That's what David's saying. Now, Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians 4, I believe, therefore I'm telling you these great things about God. I'm speaking just like David spoke, but he doesn't tell you the rest of the story. David also spoke another line, and he said, it's foolish to believe in God when you're miserable. That's what I said in my haste when things weren't going right and I wasn't grounded spiritually. That's when you know that life is starting to get to you, when you start making ridiculous statements about who God is. That's what you say in haste. And you start saying things like this. Somebody else at the church can do it. I'm busy. I hurt. I got this. I got that. We need that. We need the overtime. We need this. We need that. I said in my haste, without thinking it through spiritually, what I was actually saying. God doesn't care. God's not answering my prayer. You know, if you have a physical ailment, God doesn't always answer that. So why do we think He doesn't care? He knows what's coming for you. And so did the Apostle Paul. Let's go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 4. What am I to look at? Verse 17, look what he just described his misery. Look how Paul described his misery, getting pressed. What is Paul talking about? Paul's talking about he got beat. How many times did he get beat? 3 or 4 times. What do you mean beat? They took a rod and they beat him 39 times because 40 is going too far. 39 times they beat him with a rod. They threw him in the deep. What do you mean the deep? They threw him in an empty water well that was full of mud so that he sank up to about here. And they left him there. They threw him over a ship. They took him out and they stoned him. And this is what Paul said happened to him. That's just some light afflictions. We'd be making a movie. He'd be on a book-selling tour. He'd be on every inspirational channel in the world telling about the things he's done, the great suffering that he's gone through. And Paul says, nah, that was just what? Tell yourself that the next time you can't move. Say, in God's eyes, this is just a light affliction. And when you think of what Jesus Christ did on that cross, yep, He's right. At work, which is but for a moment. Haven't you figured it out? Some of you are 80 years old this week. How long did it seem like 80 years took? 53 years seems like it didn't take long. But for a moment worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we look not. Here's what we're not to look at. We're not to look at the things which are what? But that's what we do. We look at our bank accounts. We look at our physical bodies. We look at our sleep schedules. We look at this, we look at that, and we look at the other thing, the thing we can see, and we make spiritual decisions based upon the things we can see. And Paul said, you shouldn't do that. Now, when I start looking at the things I can see, I become a Pharisee. You know what the Pharisees were worried about? See, here sits this guy who's been lame 37 or 38 years sitting by this pool. He cannot walk. He may have been born that way, but 38 years, it doesn't matter. His legs cannot work. And Jesus says, would you, and I love this, would you like to walk? He wants an answer from him. Because Jesus is glad to do it, but He wants you to be glad to receive it. God offers salvation to every single person on this earth, but to our dismay and shock, not everybody wants it. God's willing to help every single person on this planet. But a lot of them don't want His help. So Jesus goes up to this man, you want to walk? The man says, what do you think the man says? Yeah. Well, get up. And here's the boo-boo. Take your mat and start walking. See, a guy that only sees the things you can see, like a Pharisee, there's only so many steps that guy could take. And there was only so much weight he could put in his hands. They weren't concerned that a guy who needed help got it. They were more concerned of how many steps he was going to take while he was healed. They missed the healing so that they could count his steps. Or you're more concerned, did the water get down to the tip of my elbow when I wash my hands for cleansing? Let alone thinking all the evil going on in your heart. I'm more concerned, did I get everything? Do I look shiny on the outside? Did I get enough? That's what a Pharisee's concerned about. Then I start tricking people into sin so I can go ask God ridiculous questions. Did Adam have a belly button? Well, that's something we really need to think about. That's the Pharisee. You become concerned with the outside. When you watch the outside and you stop going, she deserved it. What do you mean she deserved it? Do you see the life she's lived? She's getting everything that's coming to her. Ever heard anybody say that? And God says, oh, I've got something coming for her. Spiritual. I'm going to make her new. When you see with the outside, you become like the apostles. When Jesus is sitting next to a lady at a well who happens to be of a different race than he, and he's trying to show her the water that never runs dry, and they're over doing, what's he doing sitting with her? Don't you know you're not supposed to intermingle with her? And she, not only she's a Samaritan woman. I'm telling you, one step lower than a dog. And you're over there helping her? That's what happens when you look at you act based on the things you can see. Show me your arms. Look at all those needle marks. No wonder you're in the state you're in. Yeah. No wonder. But we like to change all that, right? God would like to change all that. And it may require you coughing up some of your own goods so that you can furnish another apartment so that you can start this process of making all things new. It may require you staying up late, listening to someone pour their heart as they struggle with living this spiritual life in this physical world where all the physical temptations are still around a person. That's what might happen. And this is what's going to happen. You're going to say, I've been at it 6 months. I am beat. I'm wore out. And here's God's admonition to you. It's just a light affliction. Don't look at the outward things. Don't get caught in the outward appearance. You're in a state of misery. Got something for misery. It's called mercy. And what do you mean mercy? It doesn't mean only unmerited favor. It means I join in your suffering. I suffer with the suffering. If you're suffering, who's there with you suffering? Jesus is. And we learn in the book of Hebrews, they made the captain of our faith, who is Jesus Christ, perfect through suffering. Jesus, you don't know how I feel. Hogwash. He knows exactly how you feel. He doesn't know how tired I am. He fell asleep in a boat with a storm. He was tired. I went out on Lake Erie, 5-foot waves. I'm telling you, I'm not sleeping. He wasn't out there on Carnival Cruise Line either. He's out there on a boat 12 feet by, I think, 17 or 20 some feet. He's getting tossed. Folks, spiritual living in a physical world, it's not easy. We get wore out, beat up, tired. Things start not working like they used to. Limbs, joints, organs, they all start falling to pots. And God says, don't worry about it. I'm going to make you what? I'm going to make you new. We're going to learn tonight, I don't think it's any coincidence, God had these messages coincide. Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. I'm to bear your burden. So I'm not supposed to be at it alone. You're supposed to be helping me. And I'm supposed to be helping you. But folks, we cannot look at the things, while we look not at the things which are seen, but the things which are not seen. And when David looked at the things that were not seen in Psalm 116, what kind of words did he have for God? Remember that? And when he started looking at the things that are seen, what kind of words did he have for God? Quite different, weren't they? Or we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are but for a time. But the things which are not seen are what? Would you not want to be used of God to make an eternal difference in someone's life? That's what he's saying. You gave up something that's only going to last for a while, your need for sleep. It's only going to last for a while. Money. It's only going to last for a while. Don't get all fixed on that. Get fixed on the things you can't see, because the things that you can't see are eternal. And folks, isn't that what you want us as believers, as a church, as a light for Jesus Christ? Don't you want us to make an eternal difference in the community? No one's going to remember us. So don't be looking at that. No one's probably ever going to know what you do or did while you were here. But God's not forgetting. That's making an eternal difference in your life and in my life. That's making an eternal difference in the lives out there. That's making an eternal difference in the lives in this world. Let's make an eternal difference, which means we can't be looking at the things we see. We have to be looking at the things we cannot see. And the thing we cannot see is our Lord. But we know He's there, and we know He makes a difference because our own lives testify to the fact Jesus changes people. And He doesn't do it on the outside, because in the past 13 years, the majority of you haven't changed on the outside, which is good news, right? But on the inside, I hope you're not the same. Let's stand.